Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar today. This is a recorded version of APQC's March 2019 KM Community Call, Communications Matter, How to Talk to Employees About KM. My name is Lauren Trees. I'm the Principal Research Lead for Knowledge Management at APQC, and I'm very glad that you all are here to discuss a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is KM communications. And as I was talking about one of my colleagues about this, earlier in the week, they reminded me of this great George Bernard Shaw quote, which I've posted in big bold letters on this slide, which is the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. And there are some questions about whether Shaw actually said this, but whoever did, they said it before the onslaught of email and Slack and Teams chat and all these different channels that we have inside the organization now. So even if I sit down and have a face-to-face conversation with someone, they may walk away with a very different notion of what I said than I do. And in today's universe, we have 8,000 different ways to communicate, but I think that's actually amplifying the illusion that communication has taken place and that we all have some kind of common understanding of what's been communicated. And I feel this pain too as a communicator in our research. I feel like I've shared and shared and shared certain things to the point where I'm blue in the face, but I realize that it still hasn't gotten through to people. So it's a real challenge in terms of the quantity of communication that's required to cut through the noise and make sure people are aware of what you want them to know. So that's the challenge. Communication is really hard. We all get 400 emails a day, and maybe we skim 40 of them and actually read, 4 or 5. So today I'm going to share APQC's latest best practices for communications in the knowledge management realm. And how do you deal with all of these challenges and get through to people is what I really want to focus on. And most of the data and examples that I'm sharing come from APQC's Promoting KM and Making It Stick research, which we've been working on for the last 7 or 8 months. So I hope that this will be helpful as a how-to guide in terms of practical, tactical things that you can do to improve the way that you are communicating about knowledge management, conveying those messages, getting through to your target audiences, your end users, and also leadership throughout the organization. We'll talk about a couple of those different audiences as we move through the presentation. And in terms of guidance and best practices, I'm going to focus on 4 specific aspects of communications. So the first is strategy, your high-level planning for what you communicate, when, where, how frequently, and how you make those decisions. Then we'll talk a little bit about branding, and that's really high level, how you position and build name recognition and a reputation for your KM program and its product lines, if you will. So your KM portal, maybe your communities of practice, knowledge sharing events that you host, that kind of thing. Then third, we're going to talk about messages. So what are you actually telling people? What benefits or aspects of KM do you actually talk about to motivate people to try it, to come back, to participate? And then finally, channels. So if the messages are what's flowing through the pipes, the channels are the pipes themselves. So how the information's being communicated, who's delivering the message, and what's the medium for delivery. So as we frequently do, we're going to start with strategy because that really informs the other 3 aspects that I want to talk about. And my first advice about KM communication strategy is you need to have one. And that sounds pretty basic, but when we've surveyed our KM audience, and we did this as part of our latest research, we found that almost half of you don't have a KM communications plan in place. And you also don't have a team member on the KM team who's either, full-time assigned to handle communications or even to handle communications as one of their many job duties. And when you start breaking that data down by industry, you see that the gaps are even bigger in certain sectors. So areas like nonprofits, financial services, insurance, and industrial products, that percentage of organizations that have infrastructure in place to support CAM communications goes down into the 25 to 35%. And the reason that I harp on this is that we at APQC find that a solid communications plan is vital to the progression of your KM program, and we've seen this consistently over many years. If you look at our KM capability assessment, we have a level 2 maturity marker around developing KM communications plans for initial KM approaches and managing messaging to sponsors and participants. And then when you reach a level 3 maturity, which is where you really standardize and start to see the full benefit of KM, you have a formal communication plan in place to make people aware of KM as a method to improve business results. So not just to be aware of the KM program, but to be aware of how it can provide value back to the organization. And I think as we talk more about branding and messages, that'll start to come out as a real theme here. And the reason that I hammer on this idea of having a communications plan a lot is because we see a huge performance gap between organizations that have communications plans in place for KM and ones that don't. Organizations with communication plans are almost 4 times more likely to have KM advocates in place across the enterprise. And that's really important in terms of embedding KM and getting people to actually participate. And those organizations are also more than 4 times more likely to be able to address barriers to knowledge sharing and use inside the organization. So whatever challenges come up that make it difficult for employees to participate or for knowledge to flow, they're just better, nimble, more nimble and more agile and more able to deal with those challenges and address them in a systematic fashion. And for those of you who may be saying, that's great, I understand maybe I need a KM communications plan, but I don't really know what that entails or how to start creating one. We just this month published our KM communication plan template in the knowledge base. So there's a link to that at the end of the presentation. And I don't think this template is rocket science, but it is helpful to see some of the components laid out. And I want to walk you through our template and how we orient the communication plans that we build. So you always need to start with an objective. And what do you want to happen as a result of communicating? So you've always got to start with the end in mind. And if you structure your plan around specific objectives, I think you'll find that helps you be a lot more streamlined and purposeful in your communications, just right off the bat. Then once you have that objective in mind, you need to define your audience. And the excerpt of a communication plan here is focused on a particular functional area and how you would communicate with end users in that functional area. But for most objectives, you're going to have different plans for different audiences because you want them to take different actions to support the objective. And you also need to present different versions of the value proposition, the what's in it for me, based on who they are. So IT, senior leadership, different functional areas are all going to have a slightly different plan based on the desired outcome and the key points that you need to communicate to them. So the way we have the template set up, we divide out communications according to a 4-phased outcome, which is sort of loosely relates to a change management process. So the first phase is awareness, and that's usually a one-way transfer of facts. So the who, what, when, where, and why of KM or whatever you're trying to communicate. Then the second phase is understanding, and this usually focuses on the personal and organizational benefits of KM or whatever change you're making. Then next is commitment, and the goal here is to make employees feel included in the change, to help them take some ownership over what you're asking them to do, and ideally to get excited about it. That's really important, to make it fun, to make it feel like something that's really going to help them and support them. And then the final one is action. And this includes a lot of ongoing communication, support, resources after the change or after the KM approach is rolled out. So there are many different ways to structure this, but you need to look at how you're communicating on some kind of trajectory that gets you to that action piece, and make sure that you're hitting all the aspects. Otherwise, I think a lot of organizations communicate through awareness and understanding, and then maybe things stop there. So people get what it is. They maybe get a little bit of how and why, but they don't feel included in that change. And then the communications drop off a month or two after it's rolled out, and they forget about it, or they go, I'm hoping that initiative goes away if I just ignore it for long enough. So, I think you got to look at it from that, that trajectory, that start to finish spectrum, from making sure that they know what's out there, to really moving them through that action and adoption phase. Then after you do that, you list out the key points for each phase, the media, so that's the channels, how it will be communicated, the person crafting and delivering the message, so there's some accountability attached to your plan, any materials or collateral or stuff that needs to be developed to execute that part of the strategy, whether that's a brochure or a video or slides, anything that you need to put out there. And then finally, timing and status so that you can track where you are in the plan. And you can play around with these categories. We see different organizations use different versions of this template, but it gives you a structure to jump off from as you think about building a plan, and helps you think about some of the elements that need to be included, whatever the final version looks like in your organization. So the second area that I want to touch on is branding. And this one's interesting because I think it's really easy to see branding for KM as window dressing that you'll worry about later. After you solve all the big problems in your KM program and roll everything out, and you have time to focus on the nice to haves. And obviously, the best branding in the world can't help you if your KM offerings are not up to snuff. You can't, brand something that's not going to provide value and expect to get the results that you want. But what we find is that branding is one of those things that's actually more important than people think in terms of getting the message out and really driving engagement. People respond to brands. That's why the Cokes and Nikes of the world spend so much money and energy honing their brands and getting them out there, getting endorsements, and obviously you're not going to go to that extent for your KM program inside your organization, but this is a practical thing that you can take on that's doable and can really help you in the communications realm. So the first part of building a KM brand in your organization is choosing the right words to describe your program. And this involves really understanding the culture in your organization, the target audience you're trying to reach, and positioning KM in a way that will speak to people, will get through their sort of armor, and make sense to them. So the first example that I have here is from Consolidated Contractors Company, which is one of the biggest construction companies in the Middle East. And they've branded their KM program and portal as Fanus, which is the Arabic and Greek word for lantern. And they use this branding to reflect the idea that KM lights the way for employees who are in the dark. They have questions, they need expertise. So you can see their lantern logo here, which uses the corporate colors and appears on all of their KM resources and communications. And one thing that was important to Consolidated Contractors Company, or CCC, when they were putting this brand together was they wanted it to feel inclusive across the different aspects of their regional workforce. So one of the reasons they actually chose the word Fanus is because it's easy to pronounce in every language that they operate in. So it's a really nice reflection of the organizational values there. So that's a great example of branding the overall program. I just wanted to point out here that it can also be helpful to brand individual communities of practice, KM-sponsored events, approaches, different elements of the KM portfolio. So, for example, in the middle, we have an example from Management Sciences for Health, which has icons and logos for all of its communities of practice. And they find that really helpful in sending out community related communications, creating infographics with community related metrics, because people see that logo and they immediately know this is from my community, this is about my community. And when people are getting hundreds of emails a day, having that little visual that they can easily glom onto and know that that's a community communication and they want to pay attention to it, it's very helpful. And then the third example here is from World Vision International, which is a big global health nonprofit. And they hosted an event called Fail Fest a few times to get employees to open up about mistakes that they've made and share lessons learned from those. And they have this catchy event name, Fail Fest. It kind of sounds interesting, sparks people's attention. And then they have this logo as well that helps communicate that. And they found that was really helpful in terms of getting the word out and just generating some conversation around, well, what is this thing called FailFest and why are you doing it and why would I want to participate? So once you've developed your brand, you really need to promote it and get it out there. So I've included a few examples of KM branding in action, if you will, on this slide. But organizations use their KM brands on their intranet, portal sites, in physical and digital posters, all sorts of marketing, videos, presentations, email, you name it. And my main message here when it comes to marketing the KM brand is it's the same as any other marketing. You really need to understand your audience and then put the brand where they're going to see it and attach it to things that they're going to like. So we've got an example here from CCC, and they're obviously a construction, company. They have a lot of people working out on job sites, so they use a lot of physical posters that they put up at the job sites, and that's how people are going to see that brand in the context of their work. And then, Accenture, they have a big remote workforce, people working out at client sites since they're a professional services organization. So they use a lot of videos to communicate about KM and get the brand out there to employees. That digital format makes sense for their dispersed workforce. And then the final example I have here is from Collins Aerospace. And they have these clever mugs that they hand out for their KM programs that say, I'm a knowledge donor to people who've participated in KM. And this is a particularly good example of branding to me because the KM team there says that people will come up to people who have the mugs and say, oh, that's a cool mug. How do I get one of those? So it helps you spread the brand in terms of word of mouth. If you have some humor, if you have something that becomes a little bit of a cachet item, in terms of swag, so you can really get, your brand to do some of that communication work for you and have it spread organically, which is great. So, and then my final thought on branding is that it really helps to think about the KM brand in the broader sense. So the catchphrases and the logos, all of that stuff is fun and good, but it's not just about that. It's really about building trust with your end users so that when they think about KM, they're confident that the tools and approaches will work and that they'll get good information. So your KM team and any community leaders, KM champions, or super users you recruit to help you out in the business, they can really function as brand ambassadors, and you want them to reflect positively on the brand. And we find that organizations do this in a few ways. First of all, they recruit people out in the business with a lot of credibility, to work on KM, either full-time or part-time. So Pfizer is a good example here. They're on-site KM specialists, who really are the visible instantiation of their KM brand, and they're out there communicating about KM at the individual manufacturing sites. They tend to be scientists or other people, in managerial roles from the business. So when they go into a team meeting and explain KM and how it can help people, they can really talk about it from a personal perspective, and people are more likely to buy in because that person who's promoting promoting KM has been in the shoes of the people that they're talking to and can really speak their language and have some credibility. And then the second is talking about KM in a way that reflects the organization's core values. So, for example, at Shopify, which is an e-commerce software company, the KM team consistently ties KM to the organizational value of high trust relationships by communicating trust scores that they calculate for content, which are based on how much of the content has been recently updated according to their update cycles. And having those trust scores and information about when the content was updated, who updated it, knowing that it's trusted, really helps employees feel confident that the resources are accurate and represent the organization's best knowledge. So it really reflects that idea of high trust relationships and builds credibility in the brand. So I'm going to switch over from branding to the closely related topic of messages. What do you need to tell people anyway? And more importantly, what types of messages are going to motivate people to try something new or to actually change their behavior? I think whether in a professional or personal setting, we all know that behavior change, especially when you begin it, is really difficult. So what can you tell people that's actually going to potentially inspire them to do that? So the first thing I want to say about messaging is that it helps to link KM to the organization's broad vision and strategy. So what is the organization trying to achieve, and how can KM enable that? And as you do that, you have to realize that different aspects of the vision and strategy will resonate with different audiences based on the role that they play in the bigger picture. So I've included an example on this slide that I think embodies both of these ideas. This is an example from MSA, which makes industrial safety equipment. And the target audience for the KM program at MSA is research and development. And what they find is that their R&D engineers are very motivated by the organization's core mission, which is protecting customers and quite literally saving their lives by designing better equipment for them. So as they promote KM, and in particular their Spring into Knowledge events, they're constantly tying the message back to that central goal. And you can see that in the two event posters that I have on this slide. One says, "Are you prepared to protect tomorrow's customers?" And then the other one says, "It takes just one idea to save a life. What's yours?" So really tying that idea of collaboration and collaborative innovation into protecting customers and saving lives. And then when they host collaborative events, they try to bring in a customer as a keynote speaker to kick off the event. So someone who's been directly helped by one of the company's products. And they find that really motivates participants to collaborate, to share their knowledge, to innovate, because they can see the end result and how it impacts people. Then beyond linking to the organizational mission and strategy, the other messages that really help support KM are success stories. So in our survey, 70% of the KM professionals we asked listed success stories as one of the top messages that resonate with employees and actually motivate behavior change. And people tend to think of success stories as something where you formally document how KM helped a project or team. It has to be evaluated. And maybe you tie some cost savings or revenue to that. And those kinds of success stories are incredibly powerful. But if you have people out in the business who are functioning as KM brand ambassadors, letting them share their personal experiences and passing on those more informal peer endorsements is also very helpful as well. And those kind of play both ends of the success stories. And a lot of times when people hear how others have used KM tools and resources, what they did with them, what value they got on their projects and things like that, it really allows them to make connections in their own mind, and they start to see how and why they might try KM as part of their own workflow. So it goes from something abstract to a tool that's real and maybe can save them an hour or reduce confusion around a particular activity. They can see that specific problem that they might be able to solve using a community of practice or using the lessons learned system, something they might have avoided. It really becomes real for people and a lot more powerful. So just to summarize, first of all, whether it's formal or informal, you've got to document and communicate those specific examples where KM has helped. That is the fuel that's going to fuel your communication plan. And in that context, it really helps to go after some quick wins and promote the heck out of them. And then you also really need to use your KM advocates, your early adopters out in the business to tell their stories. Because often when the success stories come from peers versus the central KM team, that's the most powerful. So finally today, I want to talk a little bit about channels. So, we've talked about what you need to tell people, and then, I want to talk now about the how. What are the best media to use? How do you combine different channels as part of your communication strategy? We have a million different ways to talk to people. What are the best ways to communicate different aspects of KM and different parts of the value proposition and informations and other tactical information? So when people ask which channels they need to use to communicate about KM, my answer is usually yes, yes, and yes. There's no one channel that's better than another. And as I've talked to different KM leaders in the current research, I hear that message over and over. You have to have a multi-channel strategy to make sure you reach as many people as possible and don't accidentally leave someone out. Some people will take in the message through email. Some people don't read their email, but they pay a lot of attention to Microsoft Teams or Slack or whatever kind of social channels you have in place in the organization. Some people like text. Some people like video. Some people you are absolutely going to have to get in front of them in person if you want to get through to them. So you have to do it all, at least to some extent, but you have to balance that with not annoying people. When I talked to the director of KM at Shopify, she told me that they send their updates when they have new information, new releases around products, and different content around that. They send it through a bunch of different channels, but each message only goes out once through each channel. And that helps balance things so it doesn't feel overly repetitive. Because if you're sending out little updates every hour through all these channels, people are just going to tune out and start ignoring you. So when you look at the data around how people communicate, what we do find is that face-to-face presentations and roadshows are the most common channel, followed closely by email and then word of mouth. And also when we ask survey participants which of the channels they use are most effective, they overwhelmingly say face-to-face presentations followed by messages from leaders and managers. So you can send digital communications all day long, and there's value in that, especially when you're rolling out new things. But when you're really asking people to make changes, you typically need at least some kind of more intimate touch point. And then maybe you can follow behind with some additional details via email and things like that. So we've talked a lot today about value messaging and what you tell people to get them to commit and participate in KM. But I wanted to touch a little bit on that adoption category in our KM plan because I think that's what email and digital messages are really good for. Updates on new content, other reasons to go back into that community, to go back into that repository, reasons to return. Because even if people are excited about KM when it launches, if you're not consistently reminding them, they're going to forget about it, or they're going to think that, oh yeah, I did that, and it'll slowly fall off their radar. So you need that drip of communications to keep them coming back. And ironically, at least for me, newsletters seem to be one of the methods of choice for communicating these kinds of updates. And I tend to think of newsletters as a pretty old school concept, but I've talked to a lot of organizations that use them because they're a way to send one message that includes updates, new content, success stories, all in one place. And I've got two examples here on the slide. On the right-hand side of the slide, there's an example from CCC, which has its own FANUS newsletter, where they share lessons learned and recommendations, as well as examples of KM in action at the organization. And then Shopify has a slightly different strategy. They have a customer support newsletter called Support Bites, and they build KM messaging into that broader newsletter. But a lot of the people that I talked to about newsletters said that they try to build information into those newsletters that people really want. Things like open job postings within the organization, or how to get your benefits. Different updates that are of real importance to employees in terms of growing their careers, or just compliance and things like that. And if you tuck those into those messages along with the information about KM and other things that are going on, events, things like that, then you get people to open the message, and then they start to take in those other pieces as well. And then finally, I want to emphasize the importance of leaders, managers, and other influencers as a communication channel. So you want them mentioning KM at everything from big corporate events to weekly team meetings. And these folks communicate not just with their words, but also with their actions. For example, at MSA, the engineering directors and other senior leaders participate in the kickoffs for KM events, and they talk about the importance of cross-functional collaboration as they kick off those events. And it's a real signal to employees, not just that what they're saying, but the fact that they're there and it's important enough for them to attend that event means that the event itself is important, and the knowledge sharing that's going on is important to the strategic direction of the organization, to have those leadership positions, people there and participating. And then similarly at Air Traffic Navigation Services, the KM team talked to me about the fact that the chief operating officer and other senior leaders within the organization visit their IKM labs, where they demo and test new KM capabilities. And according to the KM team, just having somebody like the COO or another executive sit down and participate, along with other employees in those events, helps everyone see that no matter who you are, you're never too important to use the system and to give input. So having leaders and managers as a communication channel, actively endorse KM and talk about its importance is critical, but also having them role model those behaviors and really sit down and share their knowledge, comment when people have posted great things or done great things, add comments to success stories, things like that, is really powerful in terms of nudging the culture in the right direction and making people realize the value that the executives, that senior leadership sees in those activities. So those are the best practices that I wanted to share today. If you're interested in digging a little bit deeper into the research or some of the things that we talked about today, I would definitely point you to our Promoting KM and Making It Stick collection, which has all of the survey results we talked about, and also in-depth case studies on the organizations that I focused on today: Consolidated Contractors Company, MSA, Shopify, World Vision, Pfizer, supervisor, air traffic navigation services. And that is an ongoing project, so we'll probably be adding some additional case studies to that collection as well. We also talked about the KM communication plan template, and I told you there would be a link to that at the end of the presentation, which is right here, and some additional resources in terms of building a communication plan in the context of, advancing your KM maturity and some additional best practices, as well as some information around how to communicate in the context of specific KM approaches like communities and knowledge mapping. So I hope that you will leverage the resources, and please come back because we're adding things on these topics as all the time. And I hope you found today helpful. And thank you very much for joining us.